Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off by thanking all of you loyal listeners yet again for joining us this weekend and hoping that your holiday season has been a joyous one thus far. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, December 27th, 2025. Our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, will be kicking things off this Saturday as he is being joined on the line by Terence Keel, professor of human biology, society, and African American Studies at UCLA. For our purposes today, Professor Keel is author of the book, The Coroner's Silence: Death Records and the Hidden Victims of Police Violence. After that, we keep you right here as Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Cassandra Shepard, assistant professor in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies at Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Professor Shepard is author of the book, Settler Colonialism is the Disaster, a critique of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Keep it locked right here so you don't miss a moment of the knowledge we have in store for you this Saturday. And of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Run DMC, John Blake, Jimmy Smith, Dexter Gordon, the Detroit Tenors, and Junior Cook. Now, people get ready for this train coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for this interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Terence Keel.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Terence Keel, Professor of Human Biology, Society, and African American Studies at UCLA, and author of the book, The Coroner's Silence, Death Records and the Hidden Victims of Police Violence. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Terence Keel.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on the show.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you produce this book?
Well, there were many reasons why I wrote this book. I think at the very top of that list is the space that I was in, the nation was in, shortly after the public murder of George Floyd. If you remember back during that time, which in many ways feels like it was much longer than 5 years ago, at the center of the controversy surrounding his death was his autopsy. The Hennepin County medical examiner said that he died of a homicide, which all of us saw with our eyes. But what we struggled to understand was what was written below that, which was George Floyd died of, quote, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual. What that meant was that George Floyd had a bad heart. His bad heart made it difficult for cops to subdue and arrest him. And because of that, they had to use more life-ending force. And I remember reading this and reading the commentary at the moment, and it occurred to me, the effort to reform our criminal justice system is focused on police and law enforcement, but we need to turn our attention to the medical examiners and coroners. If they can write things like this on death records that obscure and minimize and displace what all we saw with our own eyes, which was George Floyd was clearly killed by Derek Chauvin and the other officers. And so I wanted to know how many more George Floyds were there, and that became the genesis of this book and this project.
What role does the LA County Sheriff's Department and perhaps the LA County Coroner play in your story?
Well, I am based here in Los Angeles, though I'm working with organizers and communities around the country. Los Angeles has the largest sheriff department and policing system, including its jails, in the country. And it essentially is a extension of the state when it comes to policing and carcerality. The police department and the sheriff's department has a tremendous amount of power, but also a very well-documented history of racial injustice and abuse and discrimination against Black and Latino and other racial minorities. The sheriff's department, I would learn, in many cases around the country, has control over both the jails, where people often die in custody, but also can have power and influence over the medical examiner. When state constitutions were written in the 1800s and the early 1900s, they often embedded into state law the power of the sheriff to govern death investigation. And so what that means is that policing, since the very early history of our nation, have always been a part of investigating who dies in police custody. And also, how do we study these deaths? What we've confronted here in Los Angeles is a bit of antagonism with the sheriff's department, as you might imagine, by requesting records of people who died in their custody in the county jail system, having that request being denied, or in some cases, the records being redacted by the medical examiner at the request of the sheriff's department, which all of it says what, your listeners and you might be thinking, what are they trying to cover up? What are they trying to hide? Why not release these records publicly? And so I talk about this in the book and talk about our challenges of trying to kind of get transparency and access to these records where people are losing their lives.
And what role does Sandra Bland play in your story? And for those who may not be familiar, who was Sandra Bland?
Well, Sandra Bland was an African-American woman who died before George Floyd. And she had been stopped in Texas by a police department and shortly thereafter placed into jail, and was supposedly died in custody from hanging herself. I mention her in the book because, as tragic as her story was, there are many other Sandra Blands in this country. There are many other people who are stopped for traffic violations or stopped even for reasons that are not entirely clear, end up in jail, and then lose their lives or perish shortly thereafter. And so part of the book and the message in the book is to say that, We have a criminal justice system for a reason. People, if they commit a crime, have and should have the right to maintain their constitutional rights, be able to be in custody and to leave custody. And people like Sandra Bland and George Floyd tragically never got those opportunities. And if we really take a clear-eyed look at this system, far more people are dying in police custody than we can imagine. My lab was able to actually find that between 2000 and 2020, there were 32,104 people who died during arrests in the United States that we know of. This doesn't include jail deaths. This doesn't include deaths in prisons. It just includes people who died on the streets, like George Floyd. And so what that tells us is that this is an epidemic of death. That's more than twice the number of people who were executed in our nation's history going back to 1608. So just in 20 years, police on the streets in America have killed twice the number of people that we've officially executed. So in many ways, tragically, dying in custody has become a new type of capital punishment, and it's a system that we need to reel in.
Is it reasonable to infer that a disproportionate number of those who die in custody are African American?
Well, yes. That is because our criminal justice system, since its beginnings, has been oriented and targeted Black men, Latino men, also as well as other racial minority groups. And so Black Americans are disproportionately represented in jails and prisons and other facilities. When I looked at the data of the demographics of who are dying in police custody, what I actually found was something that was quite surprising. The largest percentage of victims were white people, and especially white men. They made up 34% of that 32,104 deaths. Black Americans made up 22% of those deaths, and Latino populations made up around 13% of those deaths. There's also a great number of people whose race could not be identified, and we believe that that was largely because of police not doing a really good job of identifying the proper race of an individual, but also mixed race people who have multiple racial identities are very illegible to our state institutions. And so the answer to your question is yes, Black American men and Latinos are disproportionately impacted by this system, but they're not the only ones. White Americans are also dying, so are conservatives, so are Republicans, so are Asian people, Muslim people, mixed race people, non-binary folks. It's an American crisis. Every segment of American demographics can be found in our nation's death ledger, and we have to reckon with this and understand that this is a system that's impacting all of us.
Speaking of which, what is the Death in Custody Reporting Act?
So the Death in Custody Reporting Act was an act passed by Congress in 2000. And it's an act that, quite frankly, it's embarrassing that our nation has never bothered to put an act like this into motion. What it essentially requires is that law enforcement agencies report annually the names of the people who die in their custody, either during arrests or while in a jail facility or some other carceral facility. The act applies to police departments and sheriff departments, but it also applies to county jails. It does not apply to federal or state institutions. They have another reporting stream. The act, unfortunately, was passed on a shoestring budget, which means when it was initially set into law, there wasn't a lot of money to actually pay for the data scientists to help be a part of this. Law enforcement, they're not trained to deal with data and demographic information, and that would matter for this story, because if you're going to gather data about people dying in custody, you want that data to be uniform. You want to be able to have things like every facility or every police department reporting race, age, gender, manner of death, location of death, if there was any documented pre-existing conditions, details that will allow you to do comparisons and analysis of the data. That didn't happen. And so what we got instead were police departments in certain counties in certain states would report maybe the race or the gender of the person, but not their name. Or they would report the name, but not the gender or the race. We would look at this data over a long period of time and found that the data in some cases was unusable. And even though it was an intervention that's a necessary one, and in 2012, Congress doubled down and tried to put more money and more resources into the Department of Justice for this effort. It still is a broken system. Why? Because it relies on police to report on the people whose lives they take. And you can see an inherent conflict of interest there. The people who are responsible for taking the lives are also responsible for writing the reports, as Ida B. Wells taught us many generations ago. So we're still in this era now. And because of that, we've had to be experimental and use crowd-based sources. So these are sources based on media sources and nonprofit organizations that are gathering this information and providing what we like to think about as a civilian brand effort to track the names of people who die in custody. I want to give a quick shout out to Pulani Wilson, who is the mother of Stanley Wilson Jr., Pulani Lucas, who's the mother of Stanley Wilson Jr., who died here in Los Angeles. She's pioneering an initiative called The Uncounted, which is a civilian-run effort for people to report when they lose a loved one in police custody or in jail. And we're going to need more civilian-run efforts like this to really get a true account of who's actually dying.
What about the Fair Access to Victims Compensation Bill? What role does that play?
Well, that bill is a bill, as far as I understand, it's about ensuring that families get resources when they are harmed either by other civilians or they're harmed by state institutions. And sort of these bills are designed to put a bit more power into people's hands when it comes to trying to get resources and justice from the state. There has been in the last few decades an emergence of restorative justice movements in places like New York and Chicago, Oakland, Los Angeles, where people are beginning to run their own civilian-run courts, being able to deal with disputes without involving police and law enforcement. And so in New York, we've seen efforts to bolster up these civilian-run courts, whereby people can settle things without having to report to police and get state funds and resources while doing it. And so that's what this bill allows. It allows for people to have justice in their own hands, but work outside of the context of law enforcement and policing, which, as we know, tragically are responsible for ending our lives, but are very often not the institutions we need when we want to settle things, or when we need institutions of care, or we need a mediator for a conflict. Police are very often exacerbate the problem rather than actually help us find justice.
What about the National Violent Death Reporting System? I assume that's an adjunct of what you've already reported.
Yeah, the National Violent Death Reporting System is a reporting system that's a complement to the Death in Custody Reporting Act. The National Violent Reporting System is an effort to gather all information and data about people who die in violent ways. So that includes law enforcement, but it also includes civilian on civilian violence. It includes industrial violence when people die in power plants or in facilities because of work occupation, automobile accidents. This is a public health oriented data reporting system that allows us to look in aggregate how people are dying under violent circumstances. It's a system that we can tap in to look at numbers of people who are dying in violent ways, but the data that they get from law enforcement encounters, again, are limited for the same reasons that the Death in Custody Reporting Act is limited, which is it requires for police to initially release the names of their victims. And you can think about why they would be reluctant to do it, or why they may do it in ways that might make the data more favorable more favorable to them rather than actually for state accountability. So we do have these reporting systems. I will say that this particular system is geared towards data scientists and people who are academics and professionals. It's not very public friendly. It's not very useful or user friendly. It's something that I think is good for academic research, but we need systems that everyday people can look at. I want to know who's dying in my county. I want to know who's died in my state. I want to know this information because I want to be an informed citizen of this democracy, and I want to hold the state accountable when it's failing everyday people.
Now, what about the Reporting of Deaths in Custody Act? Would you say that it's more public friendly or more friendly towards professionals and public health scientists?
It is more public friendly, although it certainly has an orientation for scientists and academics and scholars. Annually, the Department of Justice will release reports that are publicly available that provides summary aggregate data about who's dying, what's the race, age, gender, where are the locations of where these deaths are happening. But I think anytime you're getting a data set where an institution is doing a kind of first pass at filtering that information, you're not getting everything. You're getting parts of the data, which is what DICRA will release. You can get access behind their firewall to get more of their data, but there are credentials one has to have to do this. And this is why I think efforts like Uncounted by Polanyi Lucas, as well as Fatal Encounters, and there are many other crowdsourced data sets, they are oriented towards the people because they're inspired by the people. They are led by people who are impacted by the system or who, quite frankly, just want to reel it in. I think we need more tools like this because the better informed we are about how this system works, it allows us to leverage that knowledge, because knowledge, of course, is power, and we can translate that into making policy demands to reel in and police the police who are taking our lives.
And what about the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act? How would you characterize it?
So there's a series of acts, and this is in some ways, it's tied to the core of my book, which is trying to spotlight medical examiners and coroners. But what we got after the 1990s were a series of acts that in some ways tried to make amends for Bill Clinton's crime bill, which, for your listeners, this was one of the largest overhauls of our criminal justice system that was passed by Bill Clinton. And it in many ways carried forward some of the dreams and visions around policing and criminal justice reform that were inspired by the Nixon administration. But it really doubled down on things like creating the 3 strikes rule, creating more money for police institutions and carceral institutions, expanding the police budget for different types of weapons, reducing the age so you can charge young teenagers with criminal offenses as if they were adults, which of course disproportionately impacted Black and Latino men in places like Chicago and DC and Los Angeles. The list goes on. What we got after that is this sort of recognition by Congress and by the public that if we're going to put all this money and infrastructure into policing, we need to be able to create some sort of infrastructure to understand what's going on when policing fail, when people lose their lives. And sort of the death of the beating of Rodney King, I apologize, the beating of Rodney King was something that really sort of made it, again, a public thing for us to grapple with the fact that law enforcement can be incredibly violent, and maybe we need to be thinking about other institutions that can provide checks and balances. So there've been a series of acts to try to reel this in. But, these things work only if there is sustained funding and, quite frankly, consequences when police don't report about people who die in custody. The Death in Custody Reporting Act, for example, doesn't have a lot of teeth. If law enforcement don't report consistently or fail to report, the disincentives are not really strong enough to stop this. And I think what we really need is a bit more leadership at the federal level to actually reel in departments that are notorious for ending people's lives. And there's several of them around the country that have jail facilities that are always leading some of the top numbers in terms of people who are dying in custody. So we need more work like this. I think the ground level is a great place to start, but we're going to need some federal leadership to really bring this system in.
So what is UCLA's Lab for Biocritical Studies?
The Lab for Biocritical Studies is a lab that I founded in 2020. And it is an interdisciplinary space where we're really focused on studying the interaction of society on our bodies. And I created this lab with community partners, working here in Los Angeles, specifically Helen Jones, who lost her son, John Horton III, just before his 23rd birthday in March of 2009, where Helen Jones had been working tirelessly for a decade, trying to understand what happened to her son, educating herself about how these records are written. I had the fortune to meet her and learn from her. And from our working together, she really taught me how to look at this document and record, but through the experience of someone who's seen how this system fails and how it erases the violence that happens on people's bodies who are vulnerable. And so what I've been able to do is recruit students into the lab to analyze these records, and we turn autopsy records into data points that allows us to do summary statistics and inferential statistics, so we can analyze and identify patterns and identify what's going on, who's the vulnerable population at a specific county during a specific period of time. And then we release reports and records that lawmakers, community organizers, and everyday citizens can read those reports to get a sense of what's going on in deaths in the state of Maryland. We've released reports about that. What's happening in Los Angeles County. And more recently, the number of ICE detention deaths that have happened in this country since January of this year. And so we are a group that are deeply concerned about democratic accountability and using evidence-based data science to help push and reform our democratic institutions and make them more accountable to the people.
Finally, Terence Keel of UCLA, author of the book, The Coroner's Silence. What's next on your agenda?
Great question. You know, right now, I think that raising public awareness about this crisis in death in custody is something that is really a part of my focus, but it's important that the conscious awareness needs to be broader than just simply death. We have to think about what are the material things that people need in this country. Because if we think about that, a lot of the people who end up in police custody tragically have already been failed many times over by local, state, and federal government. These are people who don't have housing, who don't have affordable, who don't have wages that can compete with inflation, people who might be suffering from substance abuse, who can't get access to healthcare. I'm really concerned about these larger issues of care, because this is what we need as a people. We need these institutions. And so what's next is putting the book in as many people's hands as possible and talking to people like you and others to help us see this system and realize that we, the people, have the ability to design something better. We deserve it. And it requires us first to kind of look at this system with clear eyes and a kind of moral clarity. And so that's what's in front of me right now.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Terence Keel, author of the book, The Coroner's Silence. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Cassandra Shepard, Assistant Professor in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies at Xavier University in New Orleans, and author of the book Settler Colonialism is the Disaster, a critique of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Cassandra Shepard.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
Well, I produced the book because first and foremost, I'm a New Orleanian, and I had been doing work on Hurricane Katrina disaster recovery since about 2008. As an undergrad, I was doing oral history interviews with people in the lower Ninth Ward who were the hardest hit after Hurricane Katrina. And from there, it just kind of built my interest. And I went through grad school and didn't necessarily make this the foreground research, but as I went into graduate school and started to take classes, they asked me more about trauma and time and memory and post-colonialism. And every time that I had a generative course, I spoke about Hurricane Katrina. And so I think that what the book did was help me to be able to place into perspective what I saw in New Orleans, along with these framing guidelines that helped me to understand more about what was taking place. And so it was therapeutic for me to understand that there are people who are thinking about how colonialism impacts their spaces where they are, but also they're helpful for me, and they also would be helpful for people who are, in my context, people who are New Orleanians and people who are also affected by colonialism and may not have the framework, and particularly also settler colonialism. And they might not have that framework. So I thought it would be great to exhaust the ways that settler colonialism impacts New Orleans and then draw connections to other colonized spaces.
So how does settler colonialism impact New Orleans?
Well, first of all, I wanted to make sure that I was giving us a framework that could stretch even before the hurricane. So I use Hurricane Katrina and disaster recovery to kind of get into this framework that stretches beyond just the hurricane. However, the way that I speak about how it's impacting us is through the lens of recovery. So first of all, it allows us to be able to be exploited under the idea of progress, development, and recovery. And so that, when I'm speaking to people who are in the city of New Orleans and I say the United States government gave $200 billion plus for hurricane recovery in the city of New Orleans, I'll say, does the city look like it received $200 billion? And of course, people are going to say, no, it doesn't look like that. Where did that money go? And so part of the thing that gets us into the critique is the fact that the city does not look like it has been invested $200 billion of recovery dollars into it. So if it doesn't look like that, what happens with the funds? And the argument is that the funds flow the same way that it's always flowed. And the people who are harping on disasters, extracting value in terms of racial capital from minority populations, these are the people who are then in prime position to be able to receive the benefits of disaster funds. So much so that the hardest hit area, the lower Ninth Ward, still has not developed to a level that would just be considered on par with a normal neighborhood. And it's been 20 years after. However, other areas of the city that were not developed reek of the development that perhaps should have gone in the lower Ninth Ward. So we consider that to be uneven development and a sign and a symptom of capitalism, disaster capitalism, and also part of the way that I'm framing what the issue is. Because if I give it to you in this way, that the money is flowing the same way it's always flowed, that allows me to sidestep just Hurricane Katrina and speak about this exploitative, extractive, colonial system that has been operating since before the storm.
And of course, the audience, I'm sure, recalls that Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, which means it's 20 years plus since that disaster. With regard to the pandemic, how does it intersect with capitalism and settler colonialism? Of course, speaking of COVID-19 unfolding, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 2000 going forward, meaning we're marking 5 years plus since that particular episode.
Yes. So, well, first of all, New Orleans was a COVID hotspot. In fact, we were the first coronavirus hotspot because COVID broke out right around the time we held Mardi Gras. And the Trump administration knew that COVID-19 was a threat and something to be concerned about. However, because they were suppressing information, when the Department of Homeland Security came to New Orleans to prep the city, which they do every year, they did not have COVID-19 on the radar. And so we held Mardi Gras without any pandemic protocols. Now, this is also because Trump had gutted dollars from the office that would have handled pandemics. They were also dismissive of the Obama protocols that had been developed around pandemics because of the name is slipping my mind right now, but the pandemic that Obama had to deal with. They already had laid out a protocol and a playbook for how pandemics should be handled. And the Trump administration was not tapped into that information because it lacked the expertise, because Trump had gutted that office anyway and had diverted funds into other governmental investments. So that's one. So when the COVID-19 pandemic first goes underway, we are in one of our most social holidays in the city. And that forces us then to become a COVID hotspot. Additionally, we can think about the ways that this creates other types of racial disparities when it comes to health. Some of the people who I had interviewed inside of my project actually become some of the first victims and die as a result of these very lax ways of handling the pandemic. And then additionally, what we see throughout the COVID-19 pandemic is neoliberalism. So what the Trump administration decides to do is, instead of allowing the government to be an authority that then purchases equipment and then disseminates it to the states, what the government decides to do is to engage in public-private partnerships. And because they take this strategy, it then makes states compete against each other for things like PPE and vaccines. Eventually, when they come out, they're in competition with each other. They're in competition with each other and in competition with the government over resources. So this is one of the ways that we see neoliberalism play out through this public-private partnership. And then additionally, what the Trump administration then decides to do is to line the pockets through nepotism of people who he plays golf with. We know that the COVID website that was built was through some of the connections of his son. And so we see, again, the money flows the same ways that it's always flowed in these elite networks of people who are friends through nepotism and through these corporations and people who have unfair relationships with one another, to the detriment of the populations who are actually experiencing the pandemic in full swing on the ground. And additionally, I'll state that Lorenzo Veracini has a piece where he speaks about, and this is before the COVID-19 pandemic actually goes in full swing. This is like years beforehand. He has a piece that speaks about, is settler colonialism a bacteria or is it a virus? And in it, he speaks about how one commandeers hosts and another completely lives off of it in a parasitic relationship and then dismisses it. And I speak about the implications of this article being that settler colonialism will feed off of its hosts to disregard it and exploit it, or directly go in to attack and kill it. And so I speak about what the theorization of settler colonialism as a bacteria or as a virus or even as a pandemic would mean then within the framework that I've already laid out.
You also reference Beyonce, the cultural artist, and Formation, one of her signature works. How does it work its way into your narrative?
Certainly. So I had not initially wrote the book about Beyonce. And I like to say this because I want the Beehive to feel disarmed. Okay, I did not write the book trying to go after Beyonce. However, when I was finishing up my dissertation, she released the video Formation. And in Formation, she uses New Orleans as the backdrop for the video. And so of course, it became a pressing question and people wanted to know more about my thoughts about Beyonce using New Orleans in this way. And what I argue is essentially that she shows us through her video what is wrong with liberalism. And I feel like I could go deep into this, but what I do want to say is that I'll give an example. In the video, she is dancing atop a police car. And in the backlash against the video, the police association decide that they're going to boycott Beyonce. And in response, she releases a statement that says that she is not trying to be offensive to the police. And of course, she respects the police, but she is not okay with police brutality. Right. And this is kind of that liberal appeal that has to first say, OK, I am OK with the policing apparatus. I am just not OK with violent abuses of power. And this is a liberal critique, because a critique of settler colonialism would force her to engage that conversation differently. She wouldn't have to kowtow and say, well, no, I actually love the police, right? She wouldn't have to do that. She could say, well, actually, on what grounds, on what basis is the police allowed to be able to assert authority in these spaces, right? Those are more settler colonial questions to ask, which allows us to penetrate the heart of settler colonialism. But what liberalism does is it allows that colonial underpinning to stay intact and to only decide to attack one portion, the idea of violence. Now, of course, the question then becomes, well, what are you considering an abuse of power? Are you okay with when the police pull me over, tell me to hop out the car, pop my trunk, illegally search my vehicle, leave all my stuff out on the street? Is that okay? Right? Where is the guideline or the dividing line between what you consider to be an abuse of authority? Because colonial policing is inherently an abuse of authority. First, they have to assert authority, and then the abusing of authority. So that's an example. However, I also talk about how Beyonce uses some of our New Orleans artists, how she steals essentially from an artist like Messi Maya, lifts the vocals from his YouTube video where he had been, for listeners who don't know, Messi Maya was a New Orleans artist who was a victim of gun violence. He was tragically slain when he was on his way to stardom. And his videos had locally been held as something for an emerging artist, right? We hold him in high regards, very entertaining. He was really taken off. And Beyonce goes, or her team, goes to the video and extracts his vocals and uses them on formation without contacting his estate. The estate sues Beyonce over it, and she winds up saying, or her lawyers wind up saying, that his vocals are insignificant to the song. The judge rules against her. They go back and forth in court, and eventually, sometime earlier in this year, the lawsuit was settled on undisclosed terms. However, the fact that the legal team would even argue that the vocals are insignificant, when what I would argue is that she is extracting New Orleanians' authenticity, something about the rugged nature of New Orleans culture that is very attractive to the rest of the country and the world. She is using it, leveraging it on the track, and attempting not to pay the family, which is a form of extraction exploitation. And I use this kind of critique throughout some of the other connected ways that she utilizes New Orleans, the lyrics that she sings that completely disregard us as a working culture, and much more, in order to be able to discuss what are the problems of liberalism. It allows people to continue to benefit off of the colonial system staying in place, and it allows them to exploit and extract in the same colonial ways.
Speaking of which, how does anti-indigeneity work its way into your story?
Yes. So first of all, my research is informed by Indigenous studies and Indigenous studies scholars. However, when I come inside of the text, I think through this framework of how we see Indigenous erasure occurring, what Jared Sexton talks about in some of his work is this triad that has the erasure of Indigenous people through genocide, or we should say attempted genocide. Through attempted genocide, they are extracting the land and the life of Indigenous people. They are extracting the labor and the life of Black enslaved people. And both of those things are occurring for the benefit of the profit and the property of settlers. And so I think through this triad, and coming from a background of Black studies, knowing that anti-Blackness is marginalizing Black people away from critical resources in ways that place us in a closer proximity to death, we can then see how that framework also informs anti-indigeneity, which would be marginalizing Indigenous people away from critical resources like land in ways that place them in a closer proximity to death. And so not just in this framework, but all throughout the book, I hold in common Indigenous and Black struggles. And what Tiffany King writes is that we both die the same. And so I'm not trying to conflate what is happening with the two. I'm just holding them in common and using them to really shine light toward what the settler colonial system is attempting to do in both populations. And so that's how the anti-Indigenous framework comes into play.
So who is Malik Rahim, and what role does he play in your story?
Yes. Okay. So Malik Rahim is a phenomenal living legend throughout the country, and especially inside of New Orleans. And I should also say he's now a good friend through the research. Okay, so Malik Rahim let me back up. Malik Rahim is a Black Panther, okay? A living, surviving Black Panther. He survived a shootout with the police in the Desire housing projects in New Orleans. He has done massive activism out in the West Coast and in California, particularly around housing. And during Hurricane Katrina, he was in New Orleans. He survived Hurricane Katrina in Algiers Point. He was providing essential services to people who wound up coming to his home. And he started the phenomenal group Common Ground, the Common Ground Collective, out of his home with $50. And that collective then winds up starting 3 healthcare clinics. They provide essential services after the hurricane. And some of the essential services, the very first thing was they started an ice distribution center, which helped people to be able to cool off, but also allow people who had medications that needed to be cooled in order to be able to survive. He gives them ice. And then from there, he starts to give tarps and tents, and he also gives a phenomenal interview that brings in thousands of volunteers. And the volunteers camp out in his yard, all in the backyard, and they are helping and assisting him to provide services that the government had not provided in the immediate days following Hurricane Katrina. From there, they continue to expand to the point where they have a legal clinic that helps people to be able to navigate the legal terrain after Katrina. They have 3 healthcare clinics that provide those essential services. They eventually, years later, go into wetland restoration and many other different programs. They wind up doing programming out of Angola Penitentiary. He also has been instrumental in the releasing of the Angola 3. And inside of that case, the political prisoners who were some of the longest held political prisoners in solitary confinement, he was inside of their case, helping them to be able to receive justice. So this is the kind of very deep activist that it is that I'm speaking about. And I wind up following him through the book just from knowing about the work of Common Ground. I didn't know everything about Malik Rahim. And when I returned from graduate school, I followed up with him and found out more and more and more the extent of his activism. Eventually, Malik winds up being isolated from the Common Ground Collective. And what we find out is that it is at the behest of the FBI. And there is a article that recently came out that is called When the Feds Are Still Watching. And he and another Black Panther are the central figures of the story, where they explain that the FBI has been conducting surveillance on him in ways that have not ended since his shootout with the police back in I believe it was 71. He's been under investigation for a long period of time, and the feds wind up sending a person who was there just to observe, who turns provocateur and starts actively trying to bring down the Common Ground Collective. And with that type of power, they are able to leverage grants to isolate Malik out of the organization. And he is left to do other forms of activism after that. And he's continued. I should make sure that I plug that he now has the Gwangi and Hollywood Community Center in Algiers that is still providing essential services. We do free red bean Mondays, fish fry Fridays, where we give out meals to the community. He has a healthcare clinic. He has a legal clinic and all other forms of programming. We also run an emergency and disaster preparedness clinic from out of that community center as well. And so shouts out to Malik. And if anybody's interested, then they should definitely hit me about how it is that they could help him to continue to do this work.
Do you recall where that article that was just published about FBI surveillance, is there a site for it?
Yes, I believe it was published in The Nation.
Oh, I see.
And the title is When the Feds Are Still Watching.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Finally, Cassandra Shepard, author of the book Settler Colonialism is the Disaster. What's next on your agenda?
Oh, yes, this is a really great question. So first of all, this book, it came from my dissertation, and my dissertation was 600 plus pages. Now, I didn't write it to be that long. I actually wrote it to be 300 pages, but it was single spaced. And so when I hit the double space button, it grew. And so when I spoke to my my editor and my publisher, they told me that, oh, I'm sorry, when I first spoke to my committee consisting of Doctors John D. Marquez, Barner Hesse, and Darlene Clark Hine, shout out to all of them, they told me that they thought that dissertation actually held 2 books in it. And so this book is only the first part about settler colonialism. The second part is about decolonization. And then when I went and I spoke with my editor, she told me there was actually a third book in there, which is about how colonialism and decolonization situates us in time and space. And that's where some of my interventions around physics and trauma and memory are. So my next steps are to continue with editing the dissertation, to ensure that the rest of the work comes out, which is either going to be that book on time and space and memory and trauma, or it's going to be the book on decolonization. So my next step is to continue to refine this work to make sure that it's advancing and also providing the solutions to the issues that the book raises.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Terence Keel, Professor of Human Biology, Society, and African American Studies at UCLA, and author of the book The Coroner's Silence, Death Records and the Hidden Victims of Police Violence. We also thank Professor Cassandra Shepard, Assistant Professor in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies at Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana, as well as author of the book Settler Colonialism is the Disaster, a critique of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor, Baba Didan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And that's not all. Go online to the audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. With that, we send you off. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution. Have a happy new year as we ring in 2026 in a few short days.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.